I would love to know why you decided to transition your career to private philanthropy.
Well, it's probably a little bit of a long story, but I, growing up in Ghana in a small village somewhere close to Burkina Faso, it's it was a time when government felt like very distant and foreign to everybody in the village. Government never featured in anybody's life. Healthcare services was provided by herbalists and traditional healers, and so that's the only healthcare systems we knew. Education was kind of a privilege in some ways. And within the village, it was actually a preserve for the poor. And I say that because for people who were well off, you had something to keep you busy. Education was a kind of escape for the poor. Like it's something that will keep you busy because you didn't have much to do beyond, you know, your daily routines of being on the farm and the like. So in some ways, education was not something that we knew would be useful for anybody, because if you went to school, it's because you're poor and you had nothing else to do. So when I got to high school, the thinking was, okay, why is it that living in this village, government was so far from us? And that disconnect between people and their government was something that was left and center of, my thinking through high school to college, and thinking about how can I help think about ways and also contribute to how we can make governments more available and responsive to people. And so even though, my first priority in college was to pursue a career that will get me out of poverty, because in the village it was all about poverty. So going to college was like a passport to exit poverty. So my emphasis then was to look into either electronics or electrical engineering. I ended up, focusing on computer science. But then when I started working with a development institution, I realized, okay, now here I am, we're trying to do development, but I could see that politics had a lot of role to play. It's not a matter of just providing the services, but that if it has to be systematic and to bring governments closer to people, you needed to deal with politics. So I found myself veering off to do political science because I really wanted to understand politics and how I can research and try to influence what I think is the best way to influence development. And from my research, I have focused on how can we make politics work better for people? Because in my own life, in my formative years, I really didn't have government in my life. So how can I change that in a way that can impact the communities that are similar to what I lived in? And so my research has always been to improve services for people, make governments listen to people better. But then after my graduate status, I realized, okay, a job in philanthropy might provide me the opportunity both to fund research and ideas that can influence the type of change that I had hoped or I wish I had experienced when I was a kid growing up. And then secondly, that people out there have lots of ideas to do this. And so if I'm in a position to provide funding to do that, I can both provide the funding and also contribute ideas to that. And so when I saw the job for the Hewlett Foundation, in particular, the content of the strategy and the regional focus were strongly aligned with my own preferences. And so I was like, okay, this is a perfect match. And that's why I took on this job. All right. So I'll stop there. I think I'll turn it over to you as well and also
Can
ask
I
you
ask you
how.
one follow-up
Oh,
question?
yes. If you have a follow-up
Yeah.
question, yes, please.
Um, so what I think is so interesting is that, your career trajectory up until philanthropy really was kind of a personal journey of like, how do I um, move past the circumstances in which I was born,
Yeah.
but also how do I contribute to changing those circumstances for other people and for my country. And then like philanthropy was like another, sphere of doing that. And I would just love to hear like what you thought was possible in philanthropy relative to like the research and development work. kind of do you feel that the opportunities that were available kind of panned out?
In terms of what it panned out, after working 5 years in the field of philanthropy, I think philanthropy can do a lot for humanity. And I say this because I have seen the value and the contributions that we've made in the last 5 years, especially for the fields that I've been interested in. But then the impact of philanthropy, I think, is a function of how you do philanthropy. And when I say how you do philanthropy, it's one thing thinking about providing direct services to citizens. But then if we want to have lasting change and the type of experience I wanted to have with my government when I was growing up, you really need to work through the government systems. And so systemic change that can be lasting and make governments more responsive to citizens. I think that is where philanthropy can play a big role. It, it doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent feature of humanity, but that it can lead us to a state where governments are capable of doing the things that the things that philanthropy is trying to fill now. And so in by and large, my belief has always been to unleash the potential of philanthropy, first thinking about flexible long-term support that is consistent to make sure that it can lead to systems change.
Mhm.
But also secondly, engaging and interacting with grantees and the actors in the space in a way that treats them as partners as opposed to being contractors delivering for funders. And I think that's the one thing I've appreciated about the Hewlett Foundation, where you think about this as long-term systemic change that you hope would lead to governments being more responsive to their citizens. So for me, yes, philanthropy can deliver on that front, but it has to be done responsibly.
Totally in agreement, as we talked about many times.
Great. All right. Anyway, I know I'm always eager to hear more from you because anytime I speak with you, there's always something new I learn. And so I would be really curious to hear more from you, your journey from the arts and all the way down to philanthropy. How did that trajectory go for you?
Yeah, I think professionally, you know a little bit about my background in terms of the different roles that I've had. Um, I think kind of who I am and then what I've done have really shaped kind of how I eventually got to private philanthropy. As a woman of African descent that was born and raised in the US, I think it has been a major kind of shaper of the kind of professional decisions that I've made. Um, I have kind of started my career as an artist, as a dancer, um, and then moved on to become a researcher, and then have now kind of started a career as a funder. And what I found interesting is like throughout this trajectory, um, identity has played a part in kind of leading with a desire for connection, a desire to kind of learn and share and to collaborate. And definitely as a dancer, I think my first experience of working in Africa was as a dancer. I was with a company, it was a company of um, people from throughout the African diaspora, and we went to Zim and collaborated with a dance company there and with an Mbera player, performing a piece from an Afro-Cuban choreographer. And it was like an illuminating experience. I was my early, maybe mid 20s at the time. And my first experiences working in the African region was as a dancer and connecting with different artists. And when I transitioned to be a researcher, it was a very different experience. I actually went back to Zambia and Zimbabwe. And what I learned is that the role that you play really does shape how you can experience that type of connection and collaboration with people and the type of work you need to put into it. So as an artist, it was very organic and natural. As a researcher, it required quite a bit more work. And then as a funder, I think, being a researcher definitely prepared me around the power and privilege of who you are and who you represent when you're working across cultures and across nations. So it really has been quite the experience. But one thing you said around partnership, definitely I feel like my career has come full circle where as a donor, if the intention really is around partnership and to really try to dismantle some of these hierarchies of like benefactor and beneficiary. If you lead with that intention, you will eventually be able to get to the point of that type of desire for connection and collaboration that I think I really began with as an artist. So that has been my experience today. Yeah.
Excellent. And so, I mean, I know you've been at the Hewlett Foundation. Was this your first time in philanthropy?
Yes, it is as a funder. I was on a citizens committee for in Oakland back in the, I think, early 2000s. There was a bill that allowed like 2.5% of city taxes to go for children and youth services, and they were looking for citizens from each of the districts to serve on this committee that decided how that funding would be spent. So that was my first experience in in philanthropy. It was super interesting. They had young people on this committee, learned a ton about what I guess was in some ways participatory kind of decision making about grants and how adults worked with young people, how adults across Oakland is very diverse in terms of race and class, um, and how citizens from very different walks of life come together to try to make decisions on how money is spent in their city. It was a ton of work. It was a voluntary position. How you bring young people into a process and really ensure that they have enough space and information to be able to contribute to decision making as a young adult at the time was really important for me to ensure as adults, like we step back sometimes and allowed more time for young people to really get on board and make sure that if they were in disagreement, that there was space for them to voice those concerns. And so, yeah, I'm sure those experiences as well has shaped, how I think about how we operate as funders in private philanthropy. Yeah.
Yeah, and you started talking about partnerships. I know my first experience with you at Hewlett Foundation, one of the things you highlighted I have continued to work on has been, these relationships between re-granters and their African partners and how to foster some kind of equity and fairness in relationships. How has that experience been? And I'll also share my experience with it, but how has that experience been and where do you see it going forward?
Yeah, Joe, I think that was very much informed based on my experience working in NGOs, both in the US and in Africa, and seeing the inequities, experiencing it, as a mid-level researcher or a manager, seeing how development worked, looking at budgets and really trying to understand, like, okay, what is the full envelope? Oftentimes, now I've worked for African institutions who had no idea sometimes what the full envelope was in terms of what a foundation was giving. And how do you negotiate to ensure that your institution is able to be strong and sustainable while also making sure you're delivering on the work? Um, I would say maybe that's one of the motivations that brought me into private philanthropy as well. And even if it wasn't the primary motivation, once I entered and started to really understand like how our grants were kind of established, who we talked to, research, for example. I support advocacy and research grantees. And with my research grantees, as a researcher, I'm looking at these budgets and saying, like, often, African institutions are sub-grantees, they're junior partners, and their institutions are often being starved. And as a donor, you could, one, shine a light on these inequities. They're so ingrained in the way that we work that people don't even think to question them. And as a donor, like, you have the privilege and the power to actually bring those inequities to light, have conversations with all actors and say, like, let's think about a way of operating differently. And how can I, as a donor, fund in a way that allows for more equity in these partnerships? Yeah, would love to hear, like, what your experience has been in 5 years around this, around partnership.
Right. Yeah, I think that's also been one thing I've focused on when I first came in. I inherited this portfolio where more than 90% of the grantees were all Global North international NGOs working in parts of Africa. And my first instinct was, oh, wow, so I'm working here to try to influence change and government responsiveness in a continent that is led only by, organizations based here in the US or Europe or elsewhere. And so my first instinct was, I do need to figure out ways that I can shift some resources, more resources to institutions on the continent, because I've always believed that people on the ground should be the ones leading the work and defining the agendas. And even though I'm Black, I'm Ghanaian, I can't claim to know everything about Ghana, let alone talk about Africa. So if I'm going to work in Uganda, there's no way I can think that I know Uganda more than my Ugandan grantees. And so that's one thing I did. And I did two things. First, to shift resources so that instead of giving all the money to the international NGO to then re-grant to these institutions in Africa, what I did was to make separate grants where I would make a grant to an international NGO based here or somewhere in the global north, and then a separate grant to an institution in the continent. And what I do is to say, okay, you are in the continent, you know what needs to be done, lead the agenda, craft the agenda. And when you think that there's a space where your northern partner, global north partner, would add the most value, put that in the proposal and then bring them in, because I'm providing them funding as well to do similar work. And in that way, at least we're able to harness the strength of both partners. They lead the agenda, bring in their partners to complement the work they do. So that's one piece of it. The second piece, when I looked at reports in the initial stages of my time in the Althea Foundation, I realized several of these northern NGOs will take credit for an outcome in, say, Kenya or Uganda without any mention of the contribution of their local partners. And that's one thing I also highlighted. I was like, I would always ask them three questions. Who are your local partners? What contribution did they make to this program? And how do you actually recognize them in the process? And so this consistent engagement over time, I mean, I've seen several of my northern grantees now increasingly both highlight the work of their grantees, but also they make sure that they put their work out there in their publications. And that has helped some of the Africa-based organizations to actually secure additional funding because their work has been highlighted at that level, at the global level. And so at least in some ways, trying to balance that power dynamic, right? It always comes from resource control, as you say, because if you control the resources, you have the power. And I think it's funders that can make that move to shift the resources and the power. It is not just the organizations themselves, because they may control the resources, but they don't have absolute control to the extent that they can do whatever they like with the resources, because it still depends on funder restrictions. And so if we give the signals that this is the direction we want to go, I mean, it's something that would usually go along with, which is helpful.
Yeah. Joe, something that you said about contribution, I think, is so important. I think often we frame, like, who we fund
Mhm.
and who we continue to fund, over time, is around who is contributing to the ultimate outcomes. And then the other side of it is the capacity building. So I think,
Right.
the contribution part is so important, and who gets credit
Mhm.
for,
Yeah.
the impact of the work that is done, and who should be compensated for, those contributions. The other part, I think, in the grant making that has really been something that I spent a lot of time on and I've evolved my thinking is this notion of capacity building, like where knowledge sits. Often the assumption is in the global north, and who is forever in need of capacity, which is often, in our grant making, African institutions. And I have a portfolio of work that was very much centered on these global north African institution relationships that were around capacity building. And I tried to evolve my thinking of saying, like, African institutions doing advocacy work, what is the capacity building need there? They're advocates, they've been doing this. So the need is not necessarily that they need to know how to be advocates. The capacity building really is they need the resources to be able to do their work, and they need those resources to be flexible. Um, and so I changed the language to capacity strengthening. But even then, there's this assumption of a relationship that will go, to the end of time, where you are constantly in this state of dependency because you will never have the capacity to get direct funding from a donor like the Hewlett Foundation. And so it really has, forced me to interrogate, to the extent that we continue regranting through global north intermediaries, to be clear about what is the purpose of that relationship. If we have an understanding from the beginning that African institutions have the capacity to do the work, and we are building strong institutions, then it really shifts how we think about this thing about contribution, like who is producing knowledge, who is producing outcomes, and that we're not stuck in this hierarchical relationships of who has the skills and the knowledge and who needs forever to the end of time skills and knowledge. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, you're right in terms of, always thinking about capacity building as though is something that is perpetually being a way to strengthen institutions on the continent, as though these are new people who have no experience in the work that they do, and which is completely now a flawed assumption. Anyway, and well, I know you've learned a lot since you joined the foundation. Of course, you've had a bit of experience before. I think this was my first experience in philanthropy, but to date, what would you say you've learned from your experience, at least at the Hewlett Foundation, the last few years?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, my career as a researcher set me up really well to be a funder, to really understand kind of this negotiation of power and privilege, and how to use it to further the work and to ensure that whoever I'm partnering with, and whoever I'm representing, whoever I work for, really understand, like, I'm doing this on behalf of the work and behalf of the change. And so that I think when you enter into any type of partnership, um, it should be really clear on what you're working on behalf of. And then if there's trust that is built, that we are on the same page about the change we want to see, then there's more kind of transparency and honesty about, like, the how, how we can do this. So I think that's one thing that I learned. Um, I don't know what expectations. I'd love to hear, Joe, like what kind of expectations you had coming into philanthropy about how racism might show up. I guess, I'm in my mid 40s now, and some things I think at my age I've just taken as a given. Like this is the way the game is played, and I don't even question it. And I guess again, like racism is so ingrained in global development. There are certain things that, I probably didn't even challenge, like in, the first few years that I think the kind of global reckoning with racism has allowed some windows of opportunity for me to show up differently in my role and who I am, and in my role, as a program officer at the Hewlett Foundation. So definitely there has been some learning and evolution there. Would love to hear kind of your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I mean, I think same here, that learning has been kind of pretty steep for me. Coming into this space, being Black, African, Ghanaian, but to be specific, it's that sense of, am I an imposter here? And I think it is something that has stuck with me ever since I started the role at Hewlett Foundation. I started off with much of my interest in research, and I wanted to do research. And so ending up in philanthropy, the sense that I'm in a position to make decisions about how to spend somebody else's money it felt so jarring in the first year. Like I just couldn't imagine it. Like I couldn't make new grants in the first year because I felt like this is not right for me to do this. But of course, over time, I think the culture within the Hewlett Foundation has allowed me to kind of begin to grow out of that. I don't think I have still fully grown out of it, but that sense of managing a portfolio of resources and making decisions about them as a Black Ghanaian, it just felt a little too much for me to even think about. But overall, I think in general, as I started from the beginning, if philanthropy is done well, I think it does have this impact that can be palpable and then long lasting. And I think that's one thing I've learned about philanthropy. My prior experience with philanthropy, especially as a grant seeker, and how some funding was structured, I used to think that the way some of this funding is structured is unhelpful for the type of change that I'm hoping to see. But being at the foundation, I think I've learned to see how philanthropy can make a difference in the world. And I say this because when you get a one-time project grant that hardly pays for half the cost of the project, then of course you just can't do much. You end up working as a contractor and just delivering for the funder. And the second piece is where it is more about direct service delivery. Of course, this not to say that direct service delivery has no place. In philanthropy, it does have. But I think to a large extent where direct service delivery seeks to circumvent government systems can be detrimental in the long term. And this is because, one, you undermine the government system and the government itself. And so people don't have trust in the government, and they believe that international organizations are better at delivering services. And so you are just you're weakening the contract between citizens and their government by circumventing the system and then providing direct services, even though in the short term, it feels like a good thing to do. But I get a sense that such an approach is more self-serving than it is people-serving, because you get the accolades and the cheers of being a hero or a savior coming in to help people. But that certainly undermines government systems. And so the approach at the Hewlett Foundation, I think that's what I've learned, that philanthropy can do well, but you really need to structure it in a way that both reinforces what governments do, but also builds government systems over time so that those systems are more responsive as opposed to philanthropy. So those are two things like I've learned at the foundation, at least in my few years here.
I totally agree. And like the thing about the kind of saviorism of philanthropy and really what our outcomes are, both of us are going through strategy refresh processes right now. And it has really allowed an opportunity to interrogate, what are we really trying to do? What are we going to measure? What is important? If a role of philanthropy and global development is to allow for that kind of structural change that is sustainable over time, that reinforces the relationship between citizens and governments and allows, as you say, responsiveness, like the accountability. So you can either improve government systems, you can improve citizens' ability to hold government accountable. And that, to me, is sustainable. That is structural. I think when we focus on outcomes of like individual levels behaviors and I work in reproductive health, like how many contraceptive services have we allowed, it doesn't actually over time shift that relationship to make a healthier relationship between citizens and their governments,
Right.
because you've
Right.
replaced government. And you also make assumptions that governments will never have the capacity or interest in serving their people. And I think like that type of thinking is also very problematic. And so, it really, this strategy refresh processes have allowed us to rethink, if part of what we're doing is strengthening African institutions, then our outcomes have to actually reflect that. What we're measuring year after year and our implementation markers have to reflect that. It can't just reflect like how many new services, how many new commodities, were we able to, bring to women's lives, because women's reproductive health is a part of their overall well-being. As a woman, I do not wake up in the morning and just think about my reproductive health. I think about what are the aspirations that I have for my life and for my family and for my community. And then like, what is the role of philanthropy in helping individuals, communities, and governments like have a healthier relationship to ensure that individual aspirations are met and governments have the capacity and responsiveness to address those aspirations that individuals have? What is the role of philanthropy in that?
I mean, I like the fact that you brought out the issue of building strong institutions in the in Africa. And I said this because, if that is an intermediate outcome that we're actually trying to address or deliver on, then we should emphasize our implementation markers on that. Like, are we really building a robust institutional system on the continent? And that would, over time, be the ones really leading the efforts to deliver on government responsiveness. I think often, there's this sense of urgency. We really want to see the responsiveness and the service delivery coming to know that, okay, our grant dollars are making an impact. But then, without fully settling on the intermediate outcome, you shouldn't expect the ultimate outcomes to begin to follow. And I think that is where resorting to project funding for specific services becomes compelling for some funders, because like, okay, I need to be able to see something to demonstrate to the funder that, yeah, this is working. But if you commit yourself to building institutional strength and capacity in the region, and over time you do see a growing and robust institutional systems, civil society institutions that can work effectively with governments over time.
Yeah.
I think that is a core that needs to be built in a systematic way, and we shouldn't be rushing to see the impact of that now. Like, it might happen sometime a decade later or so. Anyway, and it's good to hear that. I know that in some ways your experience as yourself a Black woman, and myself, of course, I'm a Black person. I'm wondering how that has influenced your own grant making decisions in the foundation, or just life in the foundation, and also how it affects your grant making.
I think, at least in most of my professional career as both a researcher and a donor, um, based on lived experience, it was completely unacceptable to say that you were explicitly, like your identity was impacting the decisions that you make. Like that was definitely seen as inappropriate, unethical. And so I think in my experience as a Black woman, you had to downplay that your identity was shaping that. Definitely never explicitly saying that that was the case. And again, like, I think once we have a very public conversation about what I already understand to be like the very structural nature of racism in our field, then it allows for you to say, okay, now I can actually authentically bring voice to how and why my identity also is important in this decision-making process. Instead of downplaying it and making it silent and like overcoming all these stereotypes people have, and like people assume you come in here with an agenda because of your identity, and constantly negotiating and doing all this extra work around that, you could actually have an honest conversation, one, about the structures, the ideals and ideologies that influence how we fund, and then also bring voice to the fact that you bring something unique to this, given who you are. And so the last 3 years have been like definitely like a roller coaster, because I think also at this point in my life, I am used to a certain pace of change because of what I've experienced over the last 20 years. I think very different from millennials that, have a different kind of pace that they're seeing. And it requires, even though I'm a Black woman, but I'm a middle, aged Black woman at this point, a ability to shift and, seize the opportunities that are available now, at a different pace than what I've experienced previously. Yeah. And there are some other things that I've experienced as well, but very interested to hear what your experience has been over 5 years in philanthropy. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, both at the foundation, but philanthropy in general, I do think, when you are Black in this space, sometimes it's so easy to stand out in whatever space you find yourself. And like, I know that when I first joined the foundation, because the population of people of my color was not as much as it is now, which has been hugely appreciated for me, because it does make you feel like you can bring yourself fully to work, knowing that you have people who look like you. I think it's not it's an important thing to consider when you're working within an institution. I think the climax of it, of course, was when we did the collaborative grant making for the racial equity programming, which kind of got a point. I was like, okay, now I'm in this group with all these folks who look like me, and we're making decisions. And I think that was one of the points where I felt more comfortable in making decisions about somebody's money, how to spend somebody's money. And I say this because before then, I used to make the grants within my team, which was certainly, of course, collaborative, and we talk about these grants and who to fund and the like. But just having your, people of your race sitting together and having to make these decisions sort of reinforces that sense of me being comfortable really making these decisions, because I was hired for the fact that I had the expertise to make decisions about these grants, and I shouldn't let that get in the way. And secondly, yes, as you rightly point out, is there a sense that I'm coming in here with an agenda? Because if my emphasis has been to increase more funding to African institutions, should I be explicit about that? And I think in the initial stages, I just couldn't be explicit about it. It felt kind of, I'm not even sure what word to use, self-serving, to say that I want to increase funding to African institutions. Why do I want to do that? And so in some ways, even though initially, of course, there was a lot of support. I mean, Ruth was very supportive of anything you do, and she would support your decisions, which made it much easier to just go for it and say, you know what, I'm going to increase more funding to African institutions. without that level of hesitation. But without that, it's really difficult to just come out explicitly to say, this is what I want to do because, well, this is aligned with the strategy. And if that is aligned with the strategy, why not pursue it? And so, yeah, identity matters a lot. And even when I visit Africa with my colleagues, there's always a different dynamic. Here I am, I'm from Africa. If we're in Ghana, everybody sees me as a Ghanaian. Nobody sees me as a funder or a grant maker. And so the dynamic of, the power rests with my colleagues who are white. And I am kind of viewed in many ways as just a follower, somebody who's accompanied them or somebody who knows them and has come with them, and not necessarily, being in the position of a grant maker. So it does influence what you do, but more importantly, it can limit you until you get an environment that allows you to be that expressive, that you can say things that touches on your identity and then make decisions in ways that reflects your identity as opposed to, being holding back on anything. And that only happens when you have the environment to do that.
Joe, I'd love to speak on both of those things because, we have talked about these things before. And I think one, in terms of the, collaborative grant making we did around trying to address systemic racism in the US and the grants that we made together as, Black colleagues last year. One of the things that it brought out for me was to have an institution support that lived experience is a form of expertise, that it is completely acceptable and appropriate for people with lived experience to make decisions about grants that are going to impact their communities. It is not how we have always operated as a foundation or how private philanthropy operates. And I think that, that in addition to having, leaders who say, even though others may perceive this as you having an agenda or being self-serving, this is important for how we see change. And so then you don't feel that kind of hesitancy or kind of frustration of other people, because it's not like other people don't continue to see you necessarily having agenda. And so kind of you're making grants and like you're feeling necessary to kind of justify these decisions. I think the experience of like traveling with colleagues, one of the frustrations that I still continue to have, not surprising, but still frustrating, is that often our white colleagues don't see when sometimes our expertise is undermined. Even, I would say by other Africans, because again, how racism is practiced in global development is so systemic. Like I've experienced where even, and this was, I think, before I went into private philanthropy, but I might be taking public transportation with other colleagues who were white. And even a taxi driver will like put a white colleague in the front seat because that's where white people are supposed to ride, and then you have to sit in the back seat. Or they assume like you're kind of a more junior person on the team. And it's just, and I can see it even when African colleagues realize that that's not the case, and how you even have to face how racism is internalized of who we think has knowledge, has power, within these relationships. It's really difficult. It's a ton of work. It's work for us. It's work for African colleagues to kind of reshift thinking and have to come to terms with how like racism has come into these interpersonal relationships. And often our white colleagues don't see all that extra work that is happening and that people take home with them. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one thing that, you have to be able to come out to say it before people can really recognize what role you play. I know that there are several instances where we will meet with grantees and talking, and the emphasis is on wanting to focus their attention on my white colleagues. It's only when they realize, okay, I am the one who is making the decisions about this grant, that they then tend to talk to me about, a particular grant. It's always interesting, those dynamics, like it takes a lot of effort to really overcome that. And that, sense of white wealth and white control over resources is so overpowering that it takes conscious effort or even your knowledge of the fact that this person is a program officer to be able to do that. Otherwise, yes, grantees on the continent, if we have meetings, the sense is still that there's somebody else who controls the resources, and maybe you are not the real one making the decisions behind these grants that come to them. And it's a difficult hill to climb. I know that over time we would climb it, but it can be tough for those of us who have experienced philanthropy. And for me, going back to the space and then working on the front lines, I have a level of experience that is much easier for me to then interact with funders in a different way because I've had that experience. And I think overall, that is probably one of the biggest things I take away from here, that my interactions with funders as I work in an institution that will be a grant seeker would be completely different than, because I feel there are two things I think about it. That one, grantees can contribute to this issue of decolonizing development because you are in the space, and given that I've had this experience as a funder and thinking about how I've interacted with grantees, my interactions with funders is going to shift for sure. And so it's not just philanthropists and other funders who should be the ones changing the field. I think grantees are in a position to change the field as well and make it work better for everybody. And I am convinced that I've taken enough with me that I can play a role even outside of philanthropy to try to influence it from the outside.
I expect it, Joe. I sure hope that you do, because you're right. Like both sides of the partnership have to push for different ways of thinking and operating, right? Like it can't just be on this side because there's so few of us here. And we are term limited, and we decide to make decisions about, transitioning our careers. So I think that there are certain ways that we have operated that the institution has supported, but we've also changed the institution, right? And so I think there is the hope that the institution, if we're here or not here, will continue to show up consistently around how to operate in a more inclusive and equitable way. And that's what I really hope that my tenure at the foundation will allow, is institutionalizing more equitable, transformative practices. So even when we're gone, like whoever comes after us, this is a new way of operating in partnership with grantees in Africa and across the world. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, in addition to just taking away the fact that I now think that grantees on the field can help shape philanthropy, the key thing I take away from the Hewlett Foundation for sure is, the shift between the time I joined in 2016 and now has been massive in terms of how we think about, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those principles are so core to everything we do, whether it is philanthropy or governance and the like. It's just so central to what we do as human beings. And I feel like the institutional shift has been very positive, and that is one thing I'm really taking away with me, that in my new role, that is certainly going to be like the core principles we want to build on, because inclusion, really recognizing that everybody has a role to play, is important. Of course, being open and transparent about how you operate as an institution in the continent is important. So for me, the values and principles of the Hewlett Foundation are going to follow me to wherever I am. And I do know that, beyond just working within our own institution to instill those principles and values, I believe we can also use our positions as grantees to influence funders as well. So I don't only bring it to my institution, but also bringing it to other funders outside there who would benefit from an engagement and experience that I've had. at the foundation.
I am so excited about this next chapter for you, Joe. And like, as you said, it is absolutely important that this institutionalization happens, one, like what we do within Hewlett, what we do when we move beyond Hewlett, but also trying to change kind of philanthropic culture, and um, I'm just so excited about this next chapter. I want to share one thing and then ask you one more question. One thing I want to share is kind of what I've learned from you in this process. One is just, as you said, like having other colleagues who you can identify, having when I saw you, Joe, when I came to the foundation, I was very excited. And we don't always talk very openly about kind of race and around kind of how we experience our Blackness in the foundation. But some of this is unspoken, and just having a colleague there has been an absolute joy and really a comfort. And one thing that I have absolutely learned from you is you bring such grace to how you operate in this space. And it has been a lesson and kind of an inspiration that sometimes like these challenges could really make you want to just scream, but you bring such grace that creates a space to bring other people along. And I really appreciate it, like watching that and learning from it. The other thing that I've learned from you is a deep commitment to balance, and like how you balance like your professional life and your family life. And like, I think it's cultural, and I think that it's necessary that we continue to replenish and not let this work and our causes overtake us and overwhelm us, and not remember like that there needs to be this balance in our life. So I really appreciate how you've shown up in this space and what I've been able to learn from you. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. I think, the first time I heard about you, that you're coming to the foundation, I looked you up and I was like, oh, wow, okay, all right. And so that feeling of, satisfaction is just overpowering. Like I knew you were coming, and I felt really much more comfortable as a program officer in the Global Development and Population Program. But more importantly, I think when you came in, I mean, two things I've taken from you. One, the way you uphold family values and you relate with your family. I mean, it reflects in almost everything we do. And now whenever we speak, I think you put family so right and center of everything you do. And I so appreciate that, because, coming from the continent, I know what it means to be in family. And so I really appreciate that about you, that I see that in you, and that, family is something that you prioritize. But secondly, I think your commitment to these partnerships and fostering equity in these relationships, like, even though I had those initial ideas to pursue, I think the forceful way with which you came into it just gave me more courage to continue to pursue it. And that I really attribute to you. I just felt like, okay, if Althea is really doing this and going for it fully, I think I can continue to pursue this. So thanks for teaching me to be more forceful in this space than I had been before you arrived.
Thanks for that, Joe. Yeah.